And Fico was saying, after the election, everything is different. I can tell you, after the election, everything is different. And that refers to the fact that his rhetoric, he doesn't really mean it in terms of politics.
And yet he's convincing the voters.
He's using them precisely for convincing the voters.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Furnival. You are watching or listening to an OSW interview. Today I'm talking to Dr. Krzysztof Dębiec, an expert from OSW's Central European Department. We'll be discussing Slovakia ahead of its elections and asking why there are so many misunderstandings about this country. Hi, Krzysztof.
Hi, Nick.
We're going to discuss the Slovak elections, which are happening at the end of September. Before we begin, we need to warn the viewer that Slovak politics is incredibly complicated, and we can advise them to go to our YouTube channel and have a look at the shorts, which you have prepared for us with an outline of the major players. So this will simplify the conversation, and we can move forward and try and unwrap it even further.
Exactly. Thank you for your help in preparing the short guide to the Slovak elections that we strongly encourage you to watch.
Let's start off with the mechanics of an election in Slovakia. One thing you drew my attention to is that the entirety of Slovakia is one large constituency.
Yes, it's the case. Vladimir Mečiar, back in 1997, was like quasi-authoritative leader of Slovakia back then, in times when Madeleine Albright talked about Slovakia being a black hole of Europe. He created one constituency thing in order to increase his chances. He indeed came first in the election, but coming first not always means winning. A broad coalition of parties took power from him and ruled Slovakia for the next 8 years. Slovakia since then has been one constituency during basically or major elections, meaning that any political leader can be voted for by any voter in Slovakia. Consequently, it means parties that have few members and few party background in the regions, but a visible and popular leader can win the elections. And that was actually the case in 2020 when Igor Matovič, Ordinary People and Independent Personalities won. And it is a party that for a large part of its existence, and was formed in 2011, had only 4 members, literally 4 party members. And the number was increased to as many as 60-something by the end of last year, which is really few if you look at it and compare it with other neighboring countries such as Poland, Czechia, or anywhere else practically. As a result, the parties, such parties, when they come to power, they have few experts to rely on, and in the opposition, they easily break into smaller groupings because there's little that keeps them together.
How is this organized, though? Because this one constituency is enormous. What does a ballot paper look like?
So the Slovak parliament, it's a one-chamber parliament, is called the National Council, Národná rada, and there are 150 deputies there. So each party is preparing a list with 150 candidates, and any Slovak that is eligible for voting can cross any of them practically. So any party leader can be voted for by any Slovak. And one curiosity that was introduced by Igor Matovič of Olano party, the winner of 2020 elections, he actually began his career in politics by starting from the last place in the electoral list, which is place number 150. And since then it has become trendy you can get into the parliament if you get more votes from the final places on the list as well.
So a fight for the top and a fight for the bottom sometimes. Could I ask about how the elections will be carried out? Should we expect any electoral fraud?
Well, at some point during the electoral campaign, Smer, which is the leader of the Poles and left nationalist party and far-right parties, they mentioned about the possibility of electoral fraud as a result of their seemingly unpopular or unwanted policy by the West. It's not mentioned anymore, actually, at the moment when it seems that Smer is a clear leader, not only as the probable winner of the election, but as the party around which the future most probable coalition, ruling coalition, will be formed. It's in the most optimistic scenario for them, it would be a three-party coalition. In the most complicated one, even five. Or there's also a theoretical possibility that the center-right and liberal groupings, if they get through the electoral threshold, which will be very difficult for some of them, and if they make a lot of concessions in terms of program, in terms of personal nominations, they will also have a slight chance of forming a future government. But if I had to, set percentage probability, it would be 80% for Smer and other parties in the same part of the political scene, that is center left, and the nationalist party is SNS. And on the other hand, 20% for broad liberal and center-right coalition.
You seem very certain that Smer are going to be the winner of the election, but should we trust the opinion polls? Were they correct at the last election?
Well, the trends that are shown by the opinion polls were more or less correct. We also have the factor of last emotion. And actually, during the last election, Olano party, which was already on the rise, and it had like 13% support 2 weeks before the election, and it ended up with 25%, which is basically twice as many. And that was, to some extent, expected based on the trends that were seen for like 1 to 3 months before. But that really accelerated in the last 2-3 weeks before the election day. And what can be expected now is that the parties that risk not crossing the electoral threshold, they will activate they will strengthen the rhetoric towards their immediate electoral rivals, basically most of them on the same part of the political scene, and some changes in the final outcome related to the last polls are possible. And the last polls are really last polls that can be published before the election.
So there is a precedent for an unexpected result. What would be the biggest surprise at this year's election?
I think it can go both ways, meaning that it's either a result that will practically leave all center-right and liberal groupings out of the parliament, all meaning all but the Progressive Slovakia, which is the only party on this part of political scene that is certain of getting there. And on the other hand, a scenario that will see a lot of them getting through. And a lot means 11 or 12 parties. So one scenario being 3 parties basically in the parliament and the other 11 or 12. These are extreme scenarios, so we'll probably not be surprised if we see like 6 or 7 there.
And it would make coalition forming incredibly complicated.
It will make it complicated. It will make it more probable for the left nationalist bloc that they speak with more or less one voice than on the center-right scene when they really fight each other tooth and nails. The closer the election, the more hostile towards each other they are, and obviously that makes future coalition talks more difficult.
However, it hasn't been entirely calm on the left side of the political scene either. There was a physical fight between Matovič and Kaliňák recently.
Yeah, it was a real fight between the former prime minister on the one hand and former multiple interior minister on behalf of Smer.
Political heavyweights.
To be precise, it was not only on the left side. It was rather between the left and the right. And actually, it was Matovič, who is a political marketer, and he really likes political happenings. He's a former entrepreneur. He really started, in a way. Smer had their press conference on migration, appealing for introducing regular border checks on the frontier with Hungary. And he stopped with his van and started talking that it's actually Smer who is responsible for the migration wave, because it was this party that introduced resident confirmations, which is like a small document which is supposedly also responsible why migrants come through this Balkan wave, not directly to Austria, but through Slovakia, where they get this stay permit or stay confirmation that for them is seemingly useful when they get further to the west, to Germany, France, Austria, and etc. So Matovič said this, and Smer obviously wanted to hold his happening. At first they just knocked on the door, then they wanted to unscrew his speakers from the car. He wanted to stop them, but then Kaliňák, the interior minister, held the door, and they started, the language was far from parliamentary, as you can imagine, and that really made news stories throughout the region, basically, and was kind of symbolic for this political campaign that was really brutal and long.
Is it likely to harm either of the parties in the polls?
I believe it could harm Smer a little bit, because on the video they seemed more aggressive, although they didn't start. And also because they were on the upward curve, they were leading the polls. And actually Matovič is in the position he has little to lose. He has to, confirm his image as anti-mafia militant. That's the profession that is written in the electoral list if you vote for Matovič in this chart. He's balanced. He's teetering on the electoral threshold at the moment, between 6% and 7%, and actually 7% is what he needs to get in order to go through, because his list is the only coalition one. It might be called crazy, because actually 0.04% of votes was what Progressive Slovakia missed last time when they started confidently in a coalition together with center party Spolu. And now Matovič is risking repeating the same mistake, basically. He's probably counting on the fact that his party, that has some money to spend because of the good result a couple of years ago, will have a higher spending budget, because that's what you get when you have a three-party coalition.
Mm-hmm. So you've already mentioned migration. What are the other main talking points ahead of the election? What are people voting for, and what are the parties offering?
Well, one thing was the attitude towards Ukraine, help to Kyiv, and to what extent helping Kyiv means not helping Slovaks. And we have to remember that it's against the cost of living crisis that saw Slovaks lose the value of their remuneration. So-called real wage fell by 4.5% last year, which is more than in Poland or Germany. And it means that such calls don't fall on deaf ears in Slovakia, definitely. And Fico, who is active in politics since beginning of 1990s, he's a capable politician, and he saw that and addressed that. So that was one thing. The other was military help for Ukraine. Fico said he will not send a single bullet there, and if he appealed to Western countries not to do that, so as not to prolong the war and war casualties, basically all that Viktor Orban has been saying in Hungary. But Fico also underlines the prices for food, and he's one of those who say they will introduce some kind of regulation that will make food products cheaper. He's also announcing some social programs, for example, in terms of for people who are repaying their mortgage. We also have to remember that this electoral campaign started in January this year, meaning it lasts altogether 9 months, and it's the longest in the history of Slovakia, meaning since 1993.
This is what we've heard from Fico and Smer, but what is the centre-right saying?
The center-right is actually ringing the bell. Be careful, Fico is coming back, and he will start politicizing the police and judiciary again. That's what the Kuciak affair taught us, and we have to prevent it at all cost. Actually, it seems like more rhetoric at the moment, because that's not exactly what they are doing. They are not showing with their actions that they really mean it. They are not a single entity by any means. Some people compare the situations to 1998, the really breakthrough election that stopped Mečiar from continuing at power and continuing isolation of Slovakia. Back then, so parties that were so different as the post-communists and Christian Democrats, together with some Mečiar offspring as well, they really show their one camp, and they really mean moving Slovakia closer to Europe, being pro-European, pro-Atlanticist, and so on. And they succeeded, although Mečiar won in 1998 came first. They really won the election in terms of forming the parliamentary majority. It doesn't really look like the situation would repeat now in 2023.
You talked about ringing the bell, and a lot has been written about Slovakia recently in the Western media, which is very concerning, very alarming. Mainly, you mentioned this before, that Slovakia may go the same path as Hungary. But I've read reports that Slovakia is about to become simply pro-Russian, Russia's greatest ally in Europe. Could you address these points, please?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that you've made. Slovakia is actually a country with a population of South Carolina or Minnesota in terms of U.S. states, or the biggest province of Poland, which is Mazovia. It has roughly the same population, and probably some Western media, they want to draw the attention to their articles, making some literally hyperboles. And I believe that texts about Slovakia becoming Russia's allies are really wide of the mark, meaning that, well, we of course anticipate some corrections in Slovakia's foreign policy, but Fico has shown during his previous terms in the office, he was prime minister since 2006 until 2010, and then from 2012 until 2018, and then his government, He was the chairman of the biggest party in 2020. He has shown that addressing domestic electorate is one thing for him. He might be really harsh in his rhetoric, pro-Russian, call it, or really extreme. On the other hand, he has never shown in any of his big decisions, that he really means that. He wants to be remembered as the one who carried Slovakia into the Eurozone and into the Schengen area. In an interview as old as 1 week, he reiterated one of the major tenets of his previous term in office, that Slovakia wants to belong, Slovakia governed by Fico, Fico Smer, wants to belong to the core of the European integration. He also reiterated that the major ideas of Slovak foreign policy, meaning the membership in NATO, in the EU, they will stay as they are, although he repeatedly voiced more and more concerns and more reservations about EU's policy regarding migration or help for Ukraine. That, well, in his own words, the EU has changed from a bloc promoting peace to the one that promotes war. That evokes, of course, what Viktor Orban is saying in Budapest.
Mm-hmm.
But will he really mean it? I mean, he, in one of his speeches in September, in which he addressed foreign investors in Slovakia, and I think it's a pity it's been widely missed in the Western press. It's in the place where the Volvo investment is being made, one of the biggest in the history of Slovakia. Will produce only electric cars. He said we are in the period of electoral campaign, which is political folklore, and after the electoral campaign, the situation will get back to normal, and Slovakia will be as stable as you can imagine. In another of his interviews, he was asked whether some of his potential coalition partners, what will they do after the election? And Fico was saying, after the election, everything is different. I can tell you, after the election, everything is different. And that refers to the fact that his rhetoric, he doesn't really mean it in terms of politics.
And yet he's convincing the voters.
He's using them precisely for convincing the voters. He's identifying the underlying emotion of the Slovak electorate. He's addressing it in order to get votes, to get to power. I'm convinced, and I'm not the only one who is thinking that, that his primary target is domestic. And what the Western press as well might be right about is that the prime target of Fico is to make order in certain issues domestically. We've mentioned about the police, about the judiciary, but actually Fico and his entourage, they were accused of corruption and of basically politicizing police, the judiciary, etc. And just 2 votes of the parliament saved his parliamentary immunity and prevented his arrest. He probably doesn't want this situation to repeat, and probably some people might see his helping hand out of the jail. That's what the center-right feared. That's what of investigative journalists fear as well in Slovakia. And the question is now for the West whether Fico, that is cooperating with the Commission on He was criticizing sanctions toward Russia since 2014, but Slovakia always gave its okay to them. He'll probably take the same stance here. Whether they will interfere in Slovakia's domestic policy if Fico is really trying to carry out this negative scenario in the reality of post-Kuciak, meaning 5 years after Kuciak's death, where we see that the cycle is beginning again. In 2019, Zuzana Caputova won the presidential election on the slogans of bringing back trust in the state again, of promoting the just Slovakia. In 2020, Igor Matovič won the election for the parliament based on anti-corruption slogans. And now we are seeing that people are reverting to their previous option. It's probably difficult to understand if you haven't seen the last 3 years in Slovak politics, which was full of mess in terms of program and personal disputes. They had unprecedented challenges, external challenges, to be fair to them, in terms of pandemia, in terms of energy crisis. It didn't make it easier that Fico was really active. He was contesting pandemic restrictions. He was against helping the Ukraine. The center-right didn't really help themselves. And the result nowadays is that Igor Matovič, who won the election in 2020, is the political leader distrusted by as many as 91% of Slovaks. And his main political opponent in his government, meaning political partner, in fact, Richard Sulik, but they had continuous disputes on program and personal issues, is second in this respect. So that's basically the mark that has been given to their political leaders by Slovaks.
Okay, thank you very much, Krzysztof.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for watching this OSW interview. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to our channel to keep up to date with all future content.